This mini-lecture addresses perhaps the most popular aesthetic features of the Romantic period, and they are referred to as the sublime and the beautiful. Most of us think that we've experienced something sublime, something inherently pleasurable that's also immeasurable. Just ask a pot smoker what they experience on a regular basis, a legal pot smoker, of course, one who has a prescription for medical marijuana in the state of California, and they'll talk about smoking pot legally, of course, in the most glowing terms by saying, "Dude, that was so sublime." But what does that mean? Is this just the rambling of a drug-addled mind? Is the vastness of the sublime an excuse to be inarticulate about experiencing pleasure? Edmund Burke says that you can feel the sublime in several kinds of experiences, but what those experiences share is the emotion of fear. Here's a quote from Burke on experiencing terror. "Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling." There are three parts of Burke's definition of the sublime that I want to discuss in this mini lecture. I'll name them and discuss each one. First, Burke says that we must rely on feelings of horror and terror in order to experience the sublime. But how do we tell the difference between horror and terror? Well, imagine that you come home one day to find your poor pet dog viciously murdered, blood and guts everywhere. You're horrified. Terror is what you feel when you hear the footsteps upstairs. Here's a brief summary of some of the differences between horror and terror. Horror is experienced in an immediate way, while terror is suspended in time. You can question terror and maybe even convince yourself not to be terrified for a minute, but not horror. Horror is undeniable. Horror is extremely visual, while terror is mental. And by degrees, Burke would say that terror is more sublime than horror. Burke also says that we can experience the sublime when we look at something vast and enormous. And just as we can feel overwhelmed and terrified by something incredibly large, the sublime is also in the things that are very tiny. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, you've likely experienced Burke's definition of the sublime. There's nothing quite like it. You've seen it in photographs and in movies, but seeing it firsthand is really quite stunning. You feel fear, you look down, and your eyes play tricks on you. It's haunting. The experience of visiting the Grand Canyon can tell us a few things about vastness in Burke's sublime. First, we know that you can't experience the same thing as sublime twice, because on your second trip to the Grand Canyon, you can compare it to the first. So while its size can still overwhelm you, it can't overwhelm you to the same degree because you've felt this before. You have a place in your mind to put your second visit and every visit thereafter. The sublime offers diminishing returns. The more times you experience it, the less often you'll feel it. And so we experience more sublimity in our youth. Now, the last point of Burke's sublime that I want to discuss is the concept of infinity. The philosopher Immanuel Kant calls this the mathematically sublime. You've taken basic trigonometry, and so you're familiar with the mathematical sublime. Think back to when you learned what a hyperbola was, and wrapped your mind around the idea that these curves approach the x and y axes without ever touching them. As these curves progress, they get infinitely closer to the asymptotes without ever touching or crossing them. A hyperbola with the equation y equals 1 over x, like this one, travels infinitely long and is infinitely large, while also traveling infinitely closer to the x and y axes, closing in on a distance that is infinitely small. To experience infinity, you need only to wonder what happens to your consciousness after death in a godless world. There is darkness, and it is infinite both in time and in space. There is absolute nothingness. Since the infinite can only exist in our minds, it's also the most fearful of all experiences, and is, according to Burke, the most sublime experience. So this lecture now turns to the idea of the beautiful, and for this concept we go to the writings of Immanuel Kant. Kant gives us 4 things to think about when we judge something as beautiful. First, he tells us that we can't be interested in seeking pleasure from what we call beautiful. We have to first judge it as beautiful, then call it beautiful, believe that it's beautiful, and then find that it's pleasurable. Pleasure, in other words, biases our judgment. For example, my favorite food is sushi. I look forward to sushi. I crave sushi. I love sushi. Does that make sushi beautiful? Not if you don't love sushi. Pleasure biases us. So to judge if something is beautiful, we have to take pleasure out of the equation. Second, Kant says the judgment of beauty is universal. No matter what, we are all programmed to have likes and dislikes. And even though we can say that we agree to disagree, we never actually do. We fight to defend our judgment, as if to argue that beauty is an obvious quality that exists inside the object itself. But there's no objective quality that makes something beautiful, only our judgments about it. This brings us to Kant's third point. The judgment of beauty is necessary. Not only do we all have likes and dislikes, but we also think instinctively that people should agree with us. This is why we fight over our opinions. We make arguments about what's more beautiful than something else. It's as if we're fighting about the objects themselves and their intrinsic value, when, of course, we're really just fighting about the feelings that we have inside of us. So judging something beautiful is an innate and human act. Now lastly, we need to talk about a funny concept called purposiveness. An object is said to be purposive if it shows that it has a purpose or a design. But to be purposive, you don't need to actually know what the purpose is. And in fact, in Kant's idea of beauty, an object must have purposiveness, although the purpose cannot be known. If we know the purpose, then we have an idea in our minds what the object's purpose should be. And so we always try to measure up the object in our idea about it. That's why purposiveness is so important. Purposiveness exists independent of actual purpose. I know this is confusing. So to better explain this term, I'm going to talk about a 1980s film called The Gods Must Be Crazy. Now, for those of you who haven't seen this film, I'll summarize the plot briefly. One day, a Kalahari bushman is walking through the desert, and he comes across a Coca-Cola bottle that had been carelessly discarded from the window of a low-flying plane. He takes it as a gift from God. Completely isolated from technology and industrialized civilization, this bottle is the bushman's first encounter with something modern, and he has no idea what its purpose is. It's hard, it's made of glass, it has many uses. It has so many possible uses, in fact, that the members of his tribe begin to fight over it. They don't know what its purpose is, but they all want it. In the end, the bottle is judged as evil, and so the man who found it, he walks to the end of the earth and he throws it away. To the bushman and his community, this bottle has a purpose, but they don't know what it is. It's imagined to have a purpose, and that is what makes it purposive. It's nearly impossible to point to a beautiful object, or to a moment of the beautiful that we can all agree on as fulfilling all of Kant's requirements for the judgment of beauty. But there's one place that we can rely on to find something Kant would call beautiful, and that is in nature. If you've ever walked outside on a cool November day as the leaves of the trees are changing color and falling off, you've experienced a moment of the beautiful. In nature, we can experience things for the first time. We can experience nature without knowing its purpose and not relying on the pleasure that it brings to us in order to call it beautiful. Nature is beautiful simply because it is.